The 1970s, a decade of flares, disco, and children's TV that was, well, unlike anything else. Back then, kids' shows weren't afraid to be whimsical, surreal, or even a little creepy. They were imaginative, bold, and often very weird. Today, we're dusting off the VHS tapes to rediscover 10 British children's TV shows from the 70s that you might have completely forgotten about. Some will bring back warm, fuzzy memories, while others might make you wonder how we ever sat through them without being totally freaked out. Either way, it's going to be a wild, nostalgic ride. Let's dive in. Let's start with Crystal Tips and Alistair. If you grew up in the early 70s, you might remember this quirky little animated series that ran from 1971 to 1974. The show followed Crystal Tips, a girl with an enormous purple puff of hair, and her dog Alistair, who looked like he hadn't seen a bath in years. Episodes were only 5 minutes long and were, well, a bit strange. The plots were loose, the animation was wobbly, and the music had a jazzy, experimental vibe that made the whole thing feel like a bohemian art project. But for all its oddities, there was something utterly charming about the world of Crystal Tips and Alistair. It was like a warm cup of tea with a little bit of psychedelic sugar stirred in. From the surreal to the sweet, Fingerbobs is one of those shows you either remember vividly or have completely blanked out, until now. It first aired in 1972 and starred Rick Jones, who sat at a desk with his paper puppets, Fingermouse, Flash the Tortoise, Gulliver the Seagull, and a pink Scampi. The entire show was just Rick and his fingers, narrating gentle little stories in a calm, soothing voice. In an era of constant overstimulation, Fingerbobs was almost meditative. It's hard to imagine today's kids sitting still for it, but back then, it worked. There was something magical about its simplicity. Next up is Bod, which first aired in 1975. This one is pure British whimsy, a bald, stick figure character wandering through a simple cartoon world, meeting quirky friends like PC Copper, Aunt Flo, and Farmer Barleymow. Every episode included a riddle or puzzle, and then, out of nowhere, Alberto Frog and his amazing animal band would pop up to play a tune and choose a milkshake. The whole thing had an oddly calming vibe, even if it felt like a peek into someone's strange dream. For a show so minimalist, it left a lasting impression on anyone who watched it. Now, let's get a bit chaotic with Pipkins. Running from 1973 to 1981, this puppet-filled series had a ramshackle charm that could only have come from the 70s. The star was Hartley Hare, a puppet who looked like he'd been found in an attic somewhere, and sounded a bit like it too. He was joined by Top-Off the monkey, Pig, and Tortoise, and together they worked in a rather chaotic workshop. The show had a slightly gritty edge to it, with the characters often bickering or getting into trouble, but that's what made it feel so real. Looking back though, Hartley was definitely a puppet you wouldn't want to bump into in a dark alley. Of course, no list of 70s kids shows would be complete without Rhubarb. This animated classic first aired in 1974 and was all about the antics of a green dog named Rhubarb and his sarcastic pink cat neighbour, Custard. Each 5-minute episode was packed with energy, made even more chaotic by the show's iconic wobbly animation style. It was silly, over the top, and had a theme tune that you're probably humming right now. Admit it, it's impossible to forget. Now let's shift gears to something a bit darker. King of the Castle. This live-action series aired in 1977 and was the kind of show that probably gave you chills as a kid. It followed Roland, a schoolboy who was bullied and ended up transported to a strange fantasy world inside a dilapidated lift. The castle was full of bizarre and creepy characters, like the sinister Vane, and Roland had to navigate this surreal world to find his way back home. It had that eerie vibe that only 70s kids TV could pull off, just unsettling enough to keep you hooked. Time for something a bit more cheerful. Chorlton and the Wheelies ran from 1976 to 1979 and was a stop-motion masterpiece of pure chaos. Chorlton, a ridiculously happy dragon, lived in Wheelie World, where all the inhabitants were little round creatures who rolled everywhere. The villain, Vanilla the Kettle Witch, was a witch who, yes, lived in a kettle, and she spent most of her time trying to make life miserable for the Wheelies. The show was as mad as it sounds, but that's exactly why kids loved it. Then we have Jamie and the Magic Torch, which first aired in 1976. Every episode started with Jamie shining his magic torch and opening a trapdoor in his bedroom floor to travel to Cuckoo Land, a bright, psychedelic world full of eccentric characters and wild adventures. It was pure escapism, with a theme tune that gets stuck in your head the moment you hear it. If any show captured the surreal energy of the 70s, it was this one. And how could we forget Rentaghost? This ghostly sitcom started in 1976 and ran until 1984, and it's one of the most fondly remembered shows on this list. It followed a group of ghosts who ran an agency renting out their supernatural services, though they weren't exactly reliable, with characters like Timothy Claypole, the mischievous jester, and Miss pop-off who vanished every time she sneezed. It was as silly as it was spooky, and kids loved it. Finally, there's a bunch of fives. Unlike the other shows, this was a gritty teen drama that ran from 1977 to 1978. It followed a group of kids at a comprehensive school dealing with real-life problems like bullying, family struggles, and fitting in. It was grounded, relatable, and showed that kids' TV didn't always have to be about fantasy. It could tackle real issues too. And there you have it, 10 unforgettable, or perhaps very forgettable, children's TV shows from the 1970s. They were weird, wonderful, and sometimes downright bizarre, but they were all part of what made growing up in the 70s so unique. Which ones do you remember? And did we miss any of your favourites? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time for another trip down memory lane.